No one was supposed to find these papers. For more than 2 centuries, they sat wrapped in oilcloth beneath a courthouse floor in Caroline County, Virginia, forgotten by everyone except the man who hid them there. 6 bodies, 1 supper table, and 1 woman whose name the county tried to scrub out of every ledger it could find. Tonight you're going to hear what they buried with her. You're going to hear how a woman born an ocean away came to understand the forests of Virginia better than the men who claimed to own them, and how she turned that understanding into a single, unforgivable night. Why did a woman with no schooling, no rights, and no freedom possess knowledge that outpaced the county's only trained physician? What did she carry with her from the coast of West Africa that no chain could strip away? And why, when it was finally over, did the men who buried her also bury every scrap of paper that proved she had ever existed? This is the story of Naomi, and the November night she decided that 18 years of silence had earned her the right to speak in the only language left to her. The Rappahannock River bent through Caroline County like a slow, patient argument, carrying hogsheads of cured tobacco leaf down toward the ships waiting at Fredericksburg. In the autumn of 1758, this stretch of river frontage was some of the most valuable ground in the colony, and the men who owned it measured their worth in acres, in leaf weight, and in the number of human beings they could compel to work both. Ravensworth plantation claimed almost 2,000 of those acres, a spread of cleared field and standing timber that had taken 3 generations of the Ashford family to accumulate. It was, by the standards of the county, a showplace, a plantation that other men rode out to see, to study, and occasionally to envy. Charles Ashford had inherited Ravensworth from his father 11 years earlier and had spent every one of those years trying to outdo him. He was 51 years old, proud of his London tailoring and prouder still of the reputation his tobacco had built for itself in the overseas markets. But reputations, like tobacco leaves left too long in the curing barn, have a way of going brittle. By the autumn of 1758, Charles Ashford was quietly, desperately in debt, and the men who held his notes were no longer willing to wait on his harvest. His wife Eleanor had married into the plantation with a dowry substantial enough to fund its expansion into wheat and hemp alongside the tobacco. She ran the household with an arithmetic all her own, weighing every servant, every bolt of cloth, every sack of flour against its cost and its use. She was not a cruel woman by the estimation of her neighbors. She was, in her own mind, simply a practical one, and practicality in that household had a way of curdling into something colder than cruelty ever needed to be. Their household that autumn held 3 generations under one roof. Henry, 23, had returned the year before from 2 years in London with tailored coats, expensive opinions, and a conviction that his father's methods belonged to an older, slower century. Louisa, 19, was engaged to a neighboring planter's son in a match that had more to do with adjoining fence lines than affection, and the negotiations over her dowry had stalled badly as Ravensworth's finances grew thinner. William, 15, was the family's quiet disappointment, caught twice that year keeping company with enslaved children his own age, and once overheard asking his tutor why God would allow one man to own another. His parents did not know whether to punish the sentiment or the boy who held it. Rounding out the table was Eleanor's widowed sister Constance, who had come to Ravensworth after a broken engagement had left her with no household of her own, and Major Thomas Pruitt, a shipping agent whose connections in the London tobacco trade made him indispensable to Charles, and whose lingering attention toward Constance made him, in private, a source of friction. 6 people bound by blood, marriage, or business, all of them gathered that November under one roof for what Charles had promised would be a celebration of the harvest. And though none of the family knew it yet, a discussion of exactly which of their enslaved people might be sold to cover what the harvest had failed to earn. Among the enslaved men and women of Ravensworth, one woman held a position unlike any other. She had been christened Naomi by the family that purchased her, though the name she had carried across the ocean, given to her by a mother she would never see again, had been erased from every document that concerned her. She had been taken from a village near the Bight of Benin as a girl, sold through a string of hands that ended after 2 brutal years on a Barbados sugar estate, with a Virginia tobacco factor who recognized in her a skill for cooking that could be turned to profit. By 1758, she had run the Ravensworth kitchen for 18 years, and her table had built the plantation's reputation for hospitality as surely as its fields had built its reputation for tobacco. What set Naomi apart, though, was not her skill with a roasting spit, It was the fact that she could read. In colonial Virginia, this was not simply unusual, it was against the law, a crime the planter class had written into its statute books precisely because literacy among the enslaved terrified them more than any weapon could. Reading meant messages. Reading meant plans passed hand to hand. Reading meant a mind the system could not fully account for. Naomi had that mind, and for 18 years she had kept it hidden behind a mask of quiet, competent obedience. The rhythms of Ravensworth ran on the tobacco calendar and on nothing else. Before first light, enslaved men and women rose to build the fires, draw the water, and begin a day that would not end until well after dark, planting, worming, topping, and curing leaf through the growing months and through the winter, endless repair work, food processing, and the 1,000 small chores that kept a plantation of this size from falling apart. Discipline was enforced by Charles himself when the offense was serious enough to warrant his attention, and by his overseer, Silas Crane, for everything else. Crane had been hired away from a Carolina rice estate 2 years earlier, specifically for the reputation he carried with him, a reputation the white families of the county discussed only in lowered voices, and the enslaved families discussed not at all, for fear of being overheard. The harvest of 1758 had been a poor one. An early frost in September had ruined nearly a third of the standing leaf, and the debts Charles had taken on to expand into hemp cultivation were now coming due at the worst possible moment. To raise cash through the summer, he had already sold 2 families off the plantation to a Carolina buyer, husbands separated from wives, children carried off still crying for parents who could do nothing but watch. The remaining enslaved community at Ravensworth had absorbed this loss the way a body absorbs a wound it cannot treat, and the fear that more such sales were coming sat over the quarters like weather that would not break. Inside the great house, the tension took a different shape, but cut just as deep. Henry pushed his father toward more aggressive methods borrowed from what he had observed in the Caribbean: harder labor, tighter margins, and the purchase of more enslaved workers to expand production, all of it requiring capital the family did not have. Louisa's engagement had curdled from celebration into a running argument over money. William's sympathies toward the enslaved children he had grown up alongside had become, in his parents' eyes, a liability that threatened the family's authority. And Constance watched Major Pruitt's attentions with an interest she was careful never to let Eleanor see. By the second week of November, the household was a house of cards waiting for a draught of air. The 15th of November dawned the color of wet ash, frost silvering the bare oaks along the carriage drive. Charles had announced days earlier that the family would gather that evening for a formal supper, a celebration, he called it, of the harvest now finally in, though everyone in the house understood it would just as surely become a council of war over what to sell and to whom. Naomi had been given 3 days' notice to prepare it, and she used every hour of them. She oversaw the slaughter of a hog fattened through the autumn for exactly this occasion, directed the preparation of preserved vegetables drawn up from the root cellar, and was handed for the first time in months the key to Eleanor's locked spice pantry, where sugar, cinnamon, and other imported luxuries were kept under close guard. The planned menu was ambitious even by Ravensworth standards: roasted pork with a sage and thyme stuffing, a sweet potato pudding thick with molasses, cornbread enriched with butter and egg, braised winter greens, and a spiced custard pudding that required precise handling and ingredients few cooks in the county had ever been trusted to use. It was, in every sense, a display of the harvest's bounty, of Eleanor's generosity, and of Naomi's exceptional hand. In the account she would later give, Naomi described that day's work with a clarity that never left her, down to the hour she rose before dawn to start the spit turning over the kitchen's great hearth. The kitchen at Ravensworth stood apart from the main house, joined to it only by a covered breezeway, a common arrangement meant to keep fire risk away from the family's living quarters, and one that would matter a great deal to how the poisoning could have happened without a single other soul in the kitchen ever suspecting a thing. As the day wore toward evening, several small things happened that Naomi would later recall with unease. Charles came to the kitchen twice that afternoon, which he had not done in years, asking pointed questions about the spices being used and the precise order in which each course would be served, details that had never once interested him across 18 years of suppers. Eleanor followed not long after, hovering over the pots with a nervousness that did not match her usual composure. asking again and again whether everything would be ready by 6 exactly. And Major Pruitt, whose interests had never before extended past shipping manifests and interest rates, asked for a private tour of the kitchen that afternoon, examining the hearth and the storage shelves with a curiosity that struck Naomi, even then, as out of character for a man of his station. Supper was set for 6 o'clock, timed so that the family's business could be discussed over the meal without the stiffness of a formal daytime meeting. The dining room at Ravensworth held a mahogany table shipped over from England, one that could seat a dozen comfortably. That evening, only 6 places had been laid, arranged in the careful order of precedence that governed every gathering in a house like this one. None of the 6 who sat down that night would rise from the table again on their own strength, and what happened in that room over the following hours would travel through Caroline County far faster than any letter could carry it, unsettling a social order that had never once imagined it could be threatened from inside its own kitchen. Within the hour, a stable boy named Ezra had ridden bareback and half-dressed through the dark to raise the alarm at the county seat, and by the time the sun rose the following morning, armed men from 3 neighboring plantations had surrounded Ravensworth's outbuildings, and every enslaved person on the property had been rounded up under guard, while the county tried to work out whether it was looking at one woman's crime or the opening act of something far larger. Magistrate Josiah Marsh reached Ravensworth before first light, accompanied by Dr. Nathaniel Abernathy and the Reverend Josiah Cole. What waited for them in the dining room defied everything either the doctor or the magistrate thought they understood about poisoning. 6 bodies remained where they had fallen, their faces locked in expressions that spoke to real agony, and yet none of the usual signs of arsenic or mercury were present. No violent purging, no obvious burns about the mouth, nothing that matched the poisonings Dr. Abernathy had studied during his apprenticeship in Williamsburg. What struck every man in that room was the strange darkening along the victims' tongues and a faint, sweetish, almond-like scent that clung to the room for hours after the bodies had gone cold. Dr. Abernathy, whose training amounted to a 7-year apprenticeship and a shelf of second-hand European medical texts, found himself utterly without a frame of reference. He recalled reading once of certain plant-derived poisons said to occur in tropical climates capable of producing symptoms like these, but nothing in his years treating fevers and broken bones in rural Virginia had prepared him for a room full of the dead, killed with what looked like careful, deliberate skill. The investigation that followed unearthed months and eventually years of quietly accumulating grievance that no one in the great house had ever thought to notice. Under harsh and often brutal questioning, several enslaved people at Ravensworth reluctantly gave up fragments of what they knew. A house servant named Phoebe admitted she had overheard Charles and Henry arguing bitterly for weeks over whether to sell more of the plantation's people to fund Henry's expansion plans. And more damning still, she had heard Charles tell Eleanor that Naomi herself, despite her years of service, had grown too old to be worth keeping and knew too many letters to be kept around much longer, as an example to the others. A blacksmith named Isaac, questioned separately, revealed something the county had never suspected, that Naomi had spent years quietly teaching other enslaved people at Ravensworth to read, using torn pages from old almanacs, discarded newspapers, and whatever scraps of scripture she could gather, meeting in abandoned tobacco barns and stretches of forest where the group could not easily be observed. More than a dozen people, by Isaac's account, had passed through this hidden schoolroom over the years, learning not just their letters but simple arithmetic, skills that had quietly begun to serve purposes well beyond literacy itself. Isaac also told the magistrate that in the weeks before the supper, Naomi had asked, and been granted, unusual permission to gather roots and herbs from the wooded edges of the plantation for what she claimed were medicinal purposes, and had also asked to clean and reorganize the storage shed where rat poison and other pest control chemicals were kept through the winter months, substances that included compounds of arsenic and mercury used to protect the plantation's stored grain and tobacco leaf from vermin. When Magistrate Marsh finally sat Naomi down for formal questioning, he found a woman entirely unlike the frightened, broken figure he had expected. She answered every question in clear, unhurried English, her grammar and her vocabulary better than that of most white men Marsh had questioned in his career, betraying an education that no enslaved person in Virginia was supposed to possess. An understanding of property law, of court procedure, of ideas about justice that colonial society considered dangerous even coming from free white mouths, let alone from hers. Her first account of the night was a careful, deliberate performance. Yes, she had prepared the meal exactly as she always did. Yes, she had used the spices from the locked pantry with Mrs. Ashford's own permission for this special occasion. No, she had added nothing unusual, deviated from nothing that 18 years of service had already proven trustworthy. Pressed for a full accounting of her day, she offered a timeline so detailed and so easily corroborated by other servants that it seemed, on its face, to make guilt nearly impossible to fix on her, even though everyone in that dining room understood that only someone with access to the kitchen could have done what had been done. Magistrate Marsh, however, had handled cases of slave unrest before, and he did not mistake composure for innocence. Over several days of interrogation in the cold stone cell beneath the county courthouse, using every method colonial law permitted him, and several it did not, he worked to pry a different story loose, not from Naomi's confession, which would not come easily, but from an unexpected place, the stomachs of the dead themselves. Working by lamplight in the plantation's icehouse, where the bodies had been moved to slow their decay, Dr. Abernathy discovered small, dark fragments in the remains, bitter to the taste when he dared to sample them, carrying that same faint almond scent that had lingered in the dining room. He preserved the fragments in spirits and sent them by courier to a colleague in Williamsburg who had trained under physicians familiar with rarer poisons. 2 weeks later, the answer that came back changed the entire direction of the investigation and forced the county to reckon with capacities among its enslaved population it had never once imagined. The fragments, the Williamsburg physician wrote, were the processed seeds of a plant native to Virginia's own forests, one that local peoples had long used cautiously in tiny doses for medicinal purposes, but which became lethal when properly concentrated. Naomi had not simply reached for something dangerous in a moment of fury. She had spent years developing the specific knowledge required to turn a familiar forest plant into something capable of killing 6 people without a trace anyone could recognize, a process that demanded patient experimentation, careful measurement, and a scientific discipline that colonial Virginia insisted its enslaved population could not possess. The case broke wide open when a search party found Naomi's hidden workroom in an abandoned curing barn at the far edge of the plantation, well clear of the fields and the quarters both. Beneath a section of loosened floorboard, investigators uncovered a hidden cache that told a story of study, not rage. Dried plant specimens carefully sorted and labeled in a private mix of English letters and symbols no white investigator present could read, along with detailed notes on preparation, potency, and the seasonal timing that affected each plant's strength. Among the specimens was a small, worn journal, written in a hand far more disciplined than anyone expected, documenting 3 years of careful experimentation on rats and rabbits she had trapped around the property, testing doses, testing delivery, testing how well the poison's telltale scent could be masked by sugar, honey, and strong spice. One entry, dated months before the supper, read with a clinical precision that chilled the men who found it. Smaller doses produce sickness that passes, larger doses are certain. The bitter taste hides well in sweetness. The scent remains, but is easily lost beneath spice and molasses. But the journal held far more than scientific notation. Scattered between the careful measurements were passages of raw grief, entries about children she had watched sold away from their mothers, about the casual cruelties and violations enslaved women endured at the hands of the men who claimed to own them, about a hope that had worn itself down to nothing across 18 years of watching a legal system that would never once recognize her as anything but property. One entry, written only weeks before the poisoning, laid the reasoning bare. Master speaks again of selling me south, where the work kills most within a handful of years, where families are parted as easily as livestock is parted. After 18 years at his table, I am to be discarded to pay for his son's ambitions. I have learned what the forest holds. I have learned that some justice can only be bought with a price no good person should ever have to pay. Investigators pieced together a timeline stretching back nearly 3 years, to the first time Charles had floated the idea of selling off his older servants to shore up the plantation's finances. From that moment, Naomi had used her position at the center of the household, present at every meal, privy to every scrap of overheard conversation, to quietly gather the family's habits, their schedules, and the timing of the gatherings that would one day bring every decision-maker in that house to a single table at once. The date of November 15th had not been chosen by accident. It marked the traditional close of the harvest season, when accounts were settled and the year's hardest decisions were made, including, as Naomi well understood from months of listening at doorways, decisions about who among the enslaved community would be sold to cover the plantation's debts. She knew Major Pruitt would be present that night to discuss the family's finances, which meant she also knew exactly which conversation was likely to unfold once the meal was cleared. The investigation's most disturbing turn came when Marsh determined that Naomi had not acted entirely alone. Under sustained pressure, several other enslaved people admitted to knowing what she intended, and a smaller number confessed to helping, gathering plants, testing preparations, or passing word between plantations. What emerged was the outline of a quiet network stretching well beyond Ravensworth's boundaries, one built on the invisibility enslaved people were assumed to have inside white households, an invisibility that had let them gather and pass along information about finances, family conflicts, and vulnerabilities for years without a single white household ever suspecting it. Phoebe eventually admitted, after days of pressure, that she had long been part of a loose circle of enslaved women who traded information gathered from their owners' private conversations, a quiet intelligence system that had operated undetected for years and had given Naomi exactly the timing she needed to strike with minimal risk of discovery. Isaac, for his part, admitted to more than passive knowledge. He had modified kitchen tools to help grind seed and root to the fine powder her method required, built the hidden compartments where her specimens were stored, and helped carry word between enslaved communities on neighboring plantations, a revelation that convinced the county such networks were not confined to Ravensworth alone. Dr. Abernathy's continued study of the recovered plant material revealed that the danger had never come from anything exotic or hard to find. The plant grew freely throughout Virginia's forests and had been used cautiously by indigenous communities for generations before English settlement ever began. What made Naomi's work remarkable was the method she had built for concentrating and refining it, a fusion of West African botanical tradition, knowledge exchanged with native communities she had encountered, and years of her own patient trial and error, arriving at chemical principles European science would not formally describe for decades to come. As the investigation widened, magistrates in neighboring counties began re-examining old case files with new suspicion. At least 3 unexplained deaths within a 50-mile radius, previously written off as disease or misfortune, now bore an unsettling resemblance to what had happened at Ravensworth. What had looked in isolation like isolated tragedy now looked, taken together, like the visible edge of something far larger and far better hidden than the colony's authorities had ever imagined possible. And that possibility terrified them more than the crime itself. Naomi's full confession came on a cold morning in January of 1759, more than a month after the poisoning, in the same stone cell beneath the courthouse where she had spent weeks under Marsh's questioning. By then, denial had ceased to serve any purpose, and what she gave the magistrate was not simply an admission of guilt, but a full accounting of a life, beginning not with the supper itself, but with a childhood in a village near the coast, where the women who raised her had taught her which plants healed and which ones harmed. Knowledge passed mother to daughter for longer than anyone could remember. She spoke of her capture in a raid, of the horror of the crossing that followed, of watching people she had known her whole life die of disease and despair chained below deck, and of the slow, dawning realization, across years in Barbados and then Virginia, that the healing knowledge her own mother had given her could serve an entirely different purpose than the one it was meant for. She spoke plainly of watching children sold away, of enduring violations no law in the colony would ever recognize as crimes, and of coming, gradually and without drama, to understand that no court, no church, and no appeal to mercy would ever offer her or anyone she loved real protection. Learning to read, she told Marsh, had been her first act of rebellion, taught to herself in stolen minutes with torn newspaper and cast-off scripture, and it was that same stubborn literacy that had let her keep the careful records that eventually convicted her. The years of quiet experimentation that followed had not been driven by hatred of the Ashford family as individuals, so much as by a cold, considered decision to strike at the system itself, removing every person in that house who might have inherited and continued it, in the hope that what followed might scatter the enslaved community of Ravensworth into situations, however uncertain, better than the one they already knew. Her choice of poison, she explained, had been deliberate in more than one sense. She could have reached for something bought or smuggled from outside, something that would have pointed investigators toward an accomplice beyond the plantation's fences. Instead, she had turned to what grew freely in Virginia's own soil, refined through methods that owed as much to the knowledge her mother had given her as to years of patient observation conducted entirely on her own. A kind of resistance drawn quite literally from the ground the Ashfords believed they owned outright. The most haunting portion of her confession described the evening itself, watched through the kitchen window as the family sat down to a meal she had spent 3 days preparing. She told Marsh she had felt no triumph in that moment, only a heavy, exhausted sorrow at what circumstance had forced her to become, insisting she had not acted from hatred of the 6 people at that table as individuals, but from the recognition that they stood, collectively, for a system she had run out of any other way to answer. When pressed for the names of those who had helped her, Naomi refused, absorbing full responsibility for the poisoning, even though the magistrate already knew others had assisted her. It was, in its own way, the last calculated act of a woman who had spent years thinking several steps beyond the people trying to catch her, choosing at the very end to protect the community she had risked everything for, rather than save herself the additional weeks she might have bought by naming names. She closed her confession with a clear-eyed accounting of what she expected to come next. She knew she would hang, and she said so without visible fear, but she told Marsh she hoped her act might, in time, plant a seed in others who still believed no path to freedom existed for them. She predicted correctly that the county's response would be harsher surveillance and tighter restriction, and she argued just as plainly that such measures would only prove how fragile the system truly was underneath its show of confidence. Naomi was hanged in the courthouse square at Bowling Green on a bitter morning in late February of 1759, in a public execution meant to warn both enslaved and free residents of the county against any thought of following her example. People rode in from 3 neighboring counties to witness it, and colonial authorities made certain the proceedings were as visible and as final as they could make them. The colony's legal response came swiftly and reached far beyond Caroline County. New statutes restricted enslaved people's access to forested land where dangerous plants might be gathered, criminalized the unauthorized collection of any plant material whatsoever, and required planters to keep far closer watch over kitchens and food preparation across the colony. Ravensworth itself was sold at auction within the year to satisfy the family's remaining debts, and the enslaved community that had survived the ordeal was dispersed to buyers across Virginia and the Carolinas, their bonds to one another severed as completely as the Ashford family's bloodline had been. The great house stood empty for nearly a decade before a Richmond merchant purchased the land, tore down what remained of the original mansion, and built something smaller and plainer in its place. A quiet admission, in brick and timber, of just how much confidence the plantation system had lost in the wake of what had happened there. Today the site is marked only by a scattering of foundation stones, half swallowed by second-growth forest, with nothing more than a small roadside marker to hint at what once stood on that ground. The true weight of what Naomi had done reached well past Ravensworth's fence lines. Her case became, quietly and uncomfortably, a study for planters across Virginia in just how much organizational capacity and botanical knowledge existed inside communities they had convinced themselves were incapable of either. The court records from her trial were sealed by order of the county in 1759, out of fear that the details might inspire imitators, and they remained sealed for well over 2 centuries, not reopened until a courthouse renovation in 1987 uncovered the water-damaged cache in a basement storage room, waiting exactly where it had been left. Historians who examined the recovered documents found something far richer than a simple murder record: detailed testimony, painstaking botanical notation, and a woman's own words describing a childhood, a captivity, and a rebellion in language no one had expected an enslaved cook to be capable of producing. Botanical researchers who later studied her surviving journal fragments, now held by a Virginia archive, confirmed that the compounds she had identified were chemically similar to substances European science would not formally isolate for decades, making her work one of the earliest documented instances of systematic scientific experimentation carried out by an enslaved person in colonial America. More than anything else, Naomi's case forced a reckoning that Caroline County's planters never wanted to have. Proof that the people they held as property had been quietly building networks of knowledge, communication, and resistance under their very roofs for years, entirely unnoticed. The realization that their kitchens, their nurseries, and their most trusted servants might harbor exactly this kind of capacity was, for the planter class, a fear far harder to shake than the crime itself had been. The story of Naomi and the Ravensworth poisoning remains one of the most difficult cases in colonial Virginia's history to sit with honestly. It is a story about the brutal machinery of slavery and about the terrible distances a human being can be driven to travel in search of some form of justice when every ordinary path toward it has already been sealed off. It asks hard questions about violence, about desperation, and about what a system built on dehumanization forces its victims to become in order to be seen at all. It is also, unmistakably, a story about intelligence the system refused to believe existed, about a woman who conducted years of careful research, built and protected a network of allies, and carried out a plan of devastating precision while presenting every single day the calm face of total submission. That combination challenges, in a way few surviving records from this era do, the comfortable myth that enslaved people lacked the capacity to reason, to plan, and to act on their own behalf. What lingers in the end is not just the crime, but everything it revealed about the world that produced it. A woman who turned botanical knowledge inherited from her mother into an instrument of last resort, who protected the people who helped her, even at the cost of her own life, and who understood, long before she ever set that table, exactly what price her act would demand of her. The almond scent that lingered in that dining room in November of 1758 was not simply the residue of poison. It was the trace of 18 years of silence, finally breaking, of an intelligence the colony had refused to acknowledge, finally making itself impossible to ignore. The men who sealed Naomi's records in 1759 believed they were protecting the colony from imitation. What they were really protecting was their own comfortable certainty, the belief that the people who cooked their meals, raised their children, and tended their fields could never possess the mind to turn against them with such precision. Naomi proved otherwise, and the fear that provoked in them outlasted her by more than 200 years, sealed away in a basement until the day the water-stained pages finally saw daylight again. Now you know what they tried so hard to keep buried.